Then there's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, legislative priorities, opinions, and perspectives that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. After watching California's iconic Joshua trees in the Mojave National Preserve go up in flames in early August, or experiencing a first-in-a-century hurricane/tropical storm that inundates northern Mexico and southern California with heavy rain and wind and flooding, or seeing footage of a fire on the island of Maui that rode in on the blistering wind gusts of another hurricane in the Pacific and devastated the historic Maui town of Lahaina in one afternoon. If these now more common than not incidents of natural and human tragedy don't serve as a wake-up call for Americans about our in-progress climate emergency, then will anything? Luckily, California continues to be a world leader on climate, but California is not an island unto itself, and there's still so much climate work to do. And on this episode of Then There's California, we're going to be talking to one of California's state lawmakers who's helping lead the California charge for tackling climate change in people's homes, on our roadways, government and private sector, and continuing to educate Californians about what's at stake climate crisis-wise and the challenge of rising above the sea of misinformation and climate denialism. State Senator Josh Becker was elected in 2020 to represent California's 13th Senate District in the Bay Area, most of San Mateo County, and the northern part of Santa Clara County. Senator Becker is the author of several bills focused on accelerating California's transition to 100% clean energy and net zero emissions, cutting fossil fuels and greenhouse gases from millions of state-owned buildings. And so, how appropriate that he chairs the Senate Budget Subcommittee on Resources, Environmental Protection, and Energy. He is also the creator of the climate action-focused blog Getting to Zero, a title that speaks for itself in terms of its author's passion for clean energy and net zero emissions. Senator Becker joined us for the first time on this podcast in late fall of 2021 as he and his fellow legislative delegates reported from the just concluded COP26 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, Scotland. So it's been a while, and this is our first time chatting in person and one-on-one with him. We're glad to have him back. Good to see you, Senator Becker. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
How you doing?
I'm doing excellent. A lot of work here the last month. We're getting down to the nitty-gritty on some key bills, and it's going to be fun, but a lot of work.
And you're presiding in a lot of sessions, so that's been interesting too, right?
I'll probably do at least one marathon session. Yeah.
Marathon is going to be the word the next few weeks. So for a year that has been otherwise pretty tame in terms of wildfire incidents here in California compared to years past, at least in this state, thanks to our winter storms, there have been some especially notable weather and fire incidents in just the last month that I just referenced, opening our eyes further to the consequences of climate change. The York fire that damaged the Joshua trees, the devastating fire on the island of Maui, and then this hurricane/tropical storm Hillary, which pretty much took most of Southern California by surprise just this last weekend as we speak, with rain and wind and flooding. A lot of these incidents we are no stranger to here in California, but the hurricane was a bit surprising. There's just so much that is wreaking havoc here in this state, not to mention the rest of the country. So as a lawmaker, as a climate policy influencer, what's your perspective on the impact of what's going on in August in California?
Yeah, it's that. It's also the heat records that were falling daily and are falling daily across the country, across the world, and even here in our own state. And the incidents that you reference, the fires, are just more extreme and horrific examples of the elevating climate disasters that are becoming more extreme, more visible, and more devastating to more people across the state and the country. We've seen the devastating wildfires previously, although I think, God, thanks to some of the work we've done and the men and women on the front lines, we've seen less of it the last 2 years. But the reminder that we have to move more quickly, we have to be more persistent and more creative and more resolute in both reducing our emissions and adapting to the new environmental future. As you mentioned, we try to chronicle some of this on our Getting to Zero blog, and some of the budget wins particularly will be going up there very soon. But we need to have a movement that builds clean energy resources, that creates jobs, and most importantly, cuts carbon emissions.
When we last spoke, as I mentioned, in 2021 at the end of the year, when you and your delegation colleagues had just deplaned from Glasgow, Scotland, and we were talking about the COP26 meeting, we all talked about California's climate leadership reputation around the world and the concerns that were being expressed even by some of your legislative colleagues that the bloom had come off the rose, so to speak, that we were no longer leading the world on climate anymore, that countries actually were outperforming us, that Paris was ahead of us, Germany was ahead of us, India was ahead of us, and the climate goals were robust at that time, but the impact of climate change had gotten ahead of those goals. So fast forwarding here to 2023, you have written in your blog that California has returned to be this world leader on climate. So explain how we have moved back up to that first place slot and what have we accomplished just in the recent past on climate legislation.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason that many folks said that last year was the most impactful year for climate legislation in California's history. And I want to thank our pro tem and the leadership in the Senate, as well as, of course, the governor and our colleagues in the Assembly. But there was a lot of progress, and we can kind of go through some of those as we talk. But there was really a concerted effort, and again, including the governor, really coming forward at the end of session and saying, hey, here's some priorities that I have, many of which align with our priorities, but together we were able to push some really big things through. I'll just take one example. Codifying carbon neutrality by 2045. It's very important to have that goal. Okay, we are going to be carbon neutral until we set our policies to orient towards that. We tried that the previous year and had gotten, I think, 14 votes on the Senate floor. And the following year, last year, we passed basically very, very similar bill, and I don't know how many we had. I think we had 27 or 28 at the end of the day. So it was a really big difference, and many other things that we'll talk about, but it was really a tremendously important year for our climate legislation.
And are we meeting these goals? I mean, there's also cutting the greenhouse gases by 48% below 1990 levels by 2030. These are some really high aspiring goals. Are we on track to meet them? Because that's been the skeptics' pushback against us here in California is we've got these lofty goals, but there's no way we're going to meet them.
Well, we hit our first goal very clearly in terms of our 2020 reductions. We do have aggressive goals in a lot of areas. I mean, one of the biggest is to hit our greenhouse gas reduction target by 2030. And for that, I'd say, frankly, we're still not on track, and we still have a lot of work to do. Again, the legislation last year will help, but we have a lot of priorities this year, too, to get there. And it's really all three parts. It's having the goals in place. It's having what we're working on really right now, which is a lot of the operational parts. What are the bills we're doing on things like transmission, around streamlining and permitting, all the nitty-gritty that we have to do to actually operationalize these goals. And then third, the budget. Are we funding adequately this transition? Because what we're talking about is transforming our entire economy, every aspect of the economy. When you talk about buildings, transportation, agriculture, building materials, industrial, every part of our economy. So again, are we budgeting properly to do that? So we have to have all three of those, and that's what we're working towards.
Well, and the California Air Resources Board released a proposal late last year to implement what really is the most ambitious climate action of any jurisdiction in the world, taking unprecedented steps to drastically slash pollution and accelerate the transition to clean energy, but also reducing gas consumption, creating new jobs, which you're talking about, saving California $250 billion in health costs due to pollution. So the potential impact on these climate actions proposals is pretty strong. Talk about those. And again, are we on track in that regard?
Well, we are, because of what just happened. We're certainly one of the first places in the world to not just set ambitious targets, but to detail how we're going to get there. And that's the importance of what just happened in the proposal that you referred to. Now, again, there's some things we can nitpick here. We can say, hey, we should actually move faster in this area, or this area is probably not realistic. We're going to have to find the gains in other areas. But actually, the point is we laid out a roadmap, and we can now keep working on that, but really saying, okay, we know the parameters, we know the sectors, how are we going to do that? And this transition is going to require us to upgrade millions of homes and buildings, construct 100 gigawatts of new clean energy generation, build and export new technologies. I had a bill around low carbon cement. Okay, that's something that's going to have to happen worldwide.
Yes,
we need to start here. So this is really the biggest jobs and economic development opportunity of the 21st century. Our problem, I think, is going to be finding and training enough people for all the new jobs and all the new areas, whether it be, again, home electrification. The bill this year on large buildings over 50,000 square feet. A similar bill in New York City alone, they said would create $25 billion of economic activity. And obviously, California is a lot bigger than New York City. So lots of opportunity, but also lots of work to do. But the work is worth it, obviously, for the climate benefits we talked about, also the health benefits, I think, that you mentioned. We're talking about saving hundreds of billions of dollars in health costs when we reduce this kind of pollution.
And you, I think, are referencing also something that you had a press conference about a week or so ago as we speak, the Upgrade California package of legislation that would establish emission standards for the state's large commercial buildings, connecting clean appliances to the grid faster. Detail this robust package of bills and the likelihood of them getting to the governor's desk. And I should point out at this press conference, you had a block of ice carved into the shape of the California bear, and we watched it melt in the summertime heat here in Sacramento. So that was very effective.
Yes, and I did with one of my colleagues from San Francisco, who's clearly not as used to the heat, because he said he was melting clearly as well.
Faster than the ice, probably.
Yeah. But yeah, the Upgrade California package that was really driven by NRDC and Environment California, but really glad they put two of my bills in there. And this package is focused particularly on buildings, both the large commercial buildings that I mentioned a moment ago, our houses, and our schools. And there again, the benefits are extraordinary and diverse. With schools, we're talking about not only less expensive schools to operate, more comfortable schools, and just healthier schools. Because we know that if we can retrofit these schools with clean energy and also put in good airflow in the classrooms and things, we're going to make them healthier places overall, healthier from wildfire smoke, from the next possible pandemic, for all of these reasons. So it was really a package of those four bills to do that. My two bills that are in there, one of them, again, I mentioned a moment ago, focus on large buildings, SB 48. This is really taking the best practice across the country that's emerging. We're doing this really in conjunction with Washington State, Colorado, New York City that I mentioned, to say, hey, we know what, if we do the right benchmarking, and we have money in the budget to do that now with our CEC, we should know that a building of 50,000 square feet in this region of the state, what emission profile should be. And then we're going to set goals and make sure everybody gets there over time and give them plenty of time and plenty of resources and support to get there. So that's one, but we have to tackle large buildings, about 20 million metric tons of CO2 from our large buildings in California every year. And then powering up California, we have to make sure that as people are investing, as businesses are investing to electrify their buildings or to build new buildings in an all-electric way that in many cases we're now mandating, that our utilities step up, that PG&E particularly steps up and actually connects those to the grid. And I understand there's been an overwhelming demand for that, but we have to make sure they do it. We have to hold them accountable, and SB 410 will do that. So those are all part of, along with Assemblymember Haney's bill that focused more on homes, that we put together that Upgrade California package.
Let's talk about zero-emission vehicles. How's California doing with its plans to promote investment in zero-emission vehicles to make these cars and these trucks and these buses more affordable, and also push for better electric vehicle charging stations? You want us to be able to buy a zero-emission vehicle, but we need some place to charge it on the road, or it's really not going to be as efficient or as enjoyable as a fossil fuel-powered vehicle. But where are we in all of that?
Well, transportation is critical. As you know, 50% of our emissions in California come from transportation. So transportation is absolutely critical. And one of the pieces of that is electric vehicles on the passenger side. And 1/4 of all of our vehicles sold last 3 months, were electric vehicles. That was a huge milestone. 1/4 of all vehicles were electric vehicles. So, I think back to when I started working on this stuff, there's a movie called Who Killed the Electric Car? And it was talking about the demise of that one model that was, and then quickly got buried. And now you think about all the models that are coming out. So there's a lot of excitement, but it's really spurred by our policy. We're saying, hey, by 2035, these have to be all electric. And so automakers know we're going in that direction. We're all moving in that direction. They're putting more models out there, and we're seeing the momentum pick up. But again, we're not going to accomplish our goals, and certainly not in any kind of equitable way, unless we have charging infrastructure throughout the state. And that's what certainly is Budget Sub 2 chair, is our budget chair for these areas. I'm pushing, many others are pushing as well. We have to build charging infrastructure throughout the state. And we know many people charge at home, so we have to also put charging infrastructure in multifamily buildings. And we put a considerable amount of money in the budget to do this and work on that equity piece of the charging infrastructure. So again, it's one thing we can't just say it. So we put $80 billion in the final budget toward Clean Cars for All and other equity programs. I also mentioned SB 410 earlier. That's also going to be part of actually getting these charging stations deployed. But again, we're not going to succeed unless we have robust charging infrastructure across the state.
And one could say you're not going to succeed unless equality is applied in this process, as the same way it is with so much policy that comes out of the state capitol. How can California make sure the electric vehicle revolution isn't just for the wealthy few, that anyone can begin to afford these vehicles?
Yeah, one thing is we need to target our incentives, which we're doing now, on people who have lower incomes. Number one, we also need to start trying to target them on people who drive the most. If we're going to have that kind of real benefit to carbon, we know who some of these super users are. We can certainly figure out who they are. So targeting some of the incentives there too, that started with the nonprofit community. There's a nonprofit called Cultura that really led that effort. So we can really target those super users. But again, gearing those incentives for those who need it most and gearing the infrastructure build out. The other build out is happening in wealthier areas. We need to make sure that charging infrastructure is being built out in under-resourced parts of the state as well.
There's apparently a battle brewing here in California in the midst of our political climate about a pending legislative policy that would reduce dedicated funding for hydrogen passenger vehicle fueling stations and open up more support for the electric vehicle infrastructure. We have invested already millions of dollars in this hydrogen vehicle infrastructure, which has led California to have one of the largest networks of fueling stations for hydrogen vehicles and the largest number of them on the road. What are your thoughts about that? Electric vehicles, zero-emission vehicles are important, but could these budgetary actions against this hydrogen vehicle infrastructure be the last gasp for the use of these vehicles and the accessibility of these stations?
Well, I know I have several colleagues who drive hydrogen-powered cars and who like them. Overall, the numbers are overwhelming EVs. About, I think it's about 1.5 million EVs for maybe, I think 12,000 or so hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. So I think there is, again, people who do have them, who do see those as an alternative, and they want some of that money for charging or to fill up those cars. But again, the overwhelming amount is for EVs, and so we do have to focus incentives there, I would say. We also need to start thinking about medium and heavy duty trucks, and some of that will be electric as well. But that also might be a use case for hydrogen, and that would be a different kind of, but obviously a fueling infrastructure that would fit those medium and heavy duty trucks that possibly could also serve some of the passenger cars. Might be a slightly different infrastructure. But overall, we're seeing on the passenger side more and more EV uptake.
What do you drive? Just curious.
Well, I don't really have a car because I have.
Good for you! Wow.
We have.
He's walking the walk.
Well, yes, in a way, we have 4 drivers. When my kids are home, and only 2 cars. But we have a Chevy Volt plug-in hybrid that we've had now for many years, and an EV.
And so I imagine you understand California's challenges with trying to find the charging stations at the appropriate places on the highway or in town, and that balance of do we do gas, do we do electric? You get it, right?
Yeah, the charging, and we've had bills on this year. You can see what the potential is, and Tesla does have a fast charger network, and we do see fast chargers as that game changer. It's very different to pull in for 20, 30 minutes, run to the bathroom, run a couple errands, versus having to be at a charging station for 2-3 hours.
Right.
So we have to build out fast charging networks, and now we're seeing the industry really evolve in that direction. But we need to make it as easy for all EVs to find a charger, make sure it's up and running, and we've passed bills also on reliability of that charging infrastructure, and making sure that it's, again, available, functioning, fast, and that's all part of the massive build out that we need to do.
Well, I had read that several of the auto manufacturers, and specifically Ford, are adapting the Tesla charging model to their own. Not to sit here and promote Tesla, but the ubiquitousness of the Tesla charging is being used by these companies.
It's really a standard question.
Yeah.
And actually, I heard that announcement came, I think, while there was the big EV charging infrastructure trade show, and I was over there. And they're adapting. So, again, the industry will adapt to fast charging, and hopefully we have one standard, but if they need to do 2, they'll figure out a way to adapt that way as well. So I think it's, again, all going in the right direction, but we need some focused attention there.
Wind energy. Let's talk about that. A big deal here in California. We are proceeding with the large-scale offshore wind projects in our state, on our central coast, and then in our far north coast, off the coast of Humboldt, I believe, could be the country's first and largest floating offshore wind developments, $50 billion industry. Is California in the process of establishing policies that ensure the security of this economically and environmentally for this, really what is going to be the next wave of clean energy development, likely?
Well, when I think about what we need to do in general, I think about 5 things. And the first is electrify everything, right? We're electrifying transportation and electrifying buildings. But number 2, we need 100% clean grid. Right now, our grid is maybe 55, 60% clean, but we don't get those benefits unless we have a clean grid. And by the way, we're probably going to double or triple our electricity use. So that means a lot of clean energy. What's exciting about offshore wind in particular is that it's the perfect complement to solar and onshore wind. It's really going to get going when solar is starting to go down and onshore wind is starting to go down in the context of a daily cycle. So it's really important for a whole bunch of reasons. Solar is very important to build. We need to build a lot more of it, but we have to focus on that 4 to 9 p.m. time slot, particularly in the winter. That's when we're burning a lot of fossil fuels. So I've had a number of pieces of legislation very focused on that peak energy time where we're really burning by far the most fossil fuels. And wind energy, offshore wind will help with that. I went to see floating offshore wind because we have a big drop-off. Unlike the East Coast, they have fixed offshore wind. We will need floating offshore wind. And I went to see the floating offshore wind working in Europe. And we took a lot of lessons from that. And again, a lot of this comes through my budget subcommittee because we need to make sure that everybody's aligned. We're all working together. We see what the goals are, and we've got a path to get there.
As we aspire to all of this climate-friendly technology and resources, there are still concerns about environmental justice, as is so often the case with environmental and climate issues. Communities of color, low-income people in rural areas, and tribal communities, they are always hit the hardest when it comes to environmental catastrophe. And while we are collectively dealing with and trying to address these macro-focused climate and environmental challenges, many Californians are still dealing with the lack of access to safe drinking water, lack of basic plumbing and sanitation. I know the president earlier this year signed an executive order creating an Office of Environmental Justice to help focus on and reduce the burden of pollution nationwide on communities of color. What's California doing in this regard?
Well, my 5 pillars, one of them is environmental justice and extreme heat, right? We have to start preparing even more aggressively for the extreme heat that we're already seeing. And again, our subcommittee is a great place to do a lot of this work. On the extreme heat side, it's things like preparing both our homes. I mentioned earlier, if you electrify your home, if you put in what's called a heat pump, you actually get universal air conditioning as well. It serves the same function, and I think people are waking up to that. I did that in my own home, where we didn't really need air conditioning, and I moved in 25 years ago. But over the years, it's gotten hotter and hotter, and went from 5 days a year to 10 days a year to 20 days a year, where it got really difficult. And you put in a heat pump, we also get air conditioning. So if we can do that in more homes, that's going to be very helpful. And so we put in about over $400 million in the budget for what we call equitable building decarbonization to work towards that. We put in $50 million for an extreme heat and community resilience grant program. I mentioned dealing with extreme heat. We put in millions towards research grants for the most effective extreme heat mitigation strategies. So there's a lot that we can do, but a lot that we need to do for outdoor workers particularly, as well as, again, making sure that, in a state that you really didn't need air conditioning in a lot of parts of the state, we're going to need it now. So we have to do it in a way, ideally, of course, that does not use fossil fuels and that we can put this in. But environmental justice has brought, again, all the health issues, right? We just put a lot more money into what they call these once-through cooling centers that are very polluting, these peaker plants. We're trying to figure out what are ways we can phase those out, because cap and trade is effective at raising money, but it also allows people to pay to pollute. And so where does that pollution go? A lot of times it's in low-income communities. So we have to make sure that we're addressing those specific point sources as well.
Are you finding it a challenge, and this was raised in a recent news story, are you finding it a challenge to get your fellow colleagues to care about that heat issue?
I think everybody gets it, especially when we have a kind of a wave. But people can have, across the country and even in the legislature, short attention span. So then another crisis pops up. Right. So that's why I'm trying to be helpful in working with my colleagues and what are those solutions? What are the things we can actually do about extreme heat? And again, there's bigger picture things, how we design cities and tree canopy and other things as well that are also going to be important there.
There is a recent headline talk about something out of left field here, but I saw this and I thought, well, in my conversation with Senator Becker, I got to bring this up. A PPIC poll released last month said some 86% of women surveyed said addressing global climate change is a top concern, while just over 3/4 of men that were surveyed felt the same. The poll shows that men, they're more likely than women to dismiss climate issues as a serious concern. And this phenomenon even has its own nickname, the eco-gender gap. And women in California that are active around climate change say they continue to see this dynamic play out firsthand. So as a seriously concerned climate advocate and a lawmaker and a husband and the father of a daughter, here are two middle-aged men talking about this issue. What do you think's behind this eco-gender gap? Why do you think women are allegedly more concerned about climate change than men, present company excluded?
Well, I think we should celebrate, first of all, the fact that 75% of both men and women now see climate change as a top concern. That is a reason to celebrate that is on top of minds for both men and women. And that's what our polling suggests, that we do have, again, a broad spectrum, even across ideology. I've had Republicans vote for some of my bills here, and we see that people do want this addressed. So I think whether it's men or women, we're seeing really an overwhelming amount of interest and really determination to take this on.
Things are getting worse. Despite the best intentions of California and nationwide and other countries, it's getting worse. 31 to 67% of Southern California beaches may completely erode by 2100, so the stats say, without large-scale intervention. Residential and commercial buildings could be inundated by sea level rise by 2050, and other parts of the country, including California, could become less suitable for human habitation by 2070. Can't imagine California being less suitable for human habitation. These are climate goals that we don't want to reach. You and your colleagues here in 2023 still have a lot of work cut out for you. Comments on that?
Well, a lot of things come to mind. I mean, number one, my own area in San Mateo County particularly is kind of ground zero for some of the effects they expect about possibly on track for 3.5 feet of sea level rise by 2100. That would mean not only many neighborhoods, but also substations, SFO, potentially major highways. So we have a lot that's at risk. And by the way, as much as we need to reduce carbon, we do have to do some climate adaptation as well. Some stuff that we know we're going to feel some effects. We can't put our head in the sand. We have to be working on flooding and other issues. Again, wildfire, of course, with our eyes wide open. But again, this is an urgent call. And when, the very first issue, I'd say, or, episode of my blog, the very first post, I talked about how when I started working on the EPA, the very first Clean Air Marketplace conference EPA did in the 90s, and that we helped them with. And I remember at the time looking around and saying, wow, I've seen some of the new technology, but there were still a lot of gaps, right? We knew that we just weren't ready for the transition from a technology standpoint in all areas. Now we are. It's really just a matter of will and dollars, dollars to fund the transition. Again, ultimately, it'll pay for itself in many ways, but dollars to fund the transition and political will. We know that the solutions are there in all those areas we talked about, whether it's transportation, whether it's buildings, whether it's agriculture. And we need, as a state, also to leverage our purchasing power to make sure that we are buying these new solutions that brings down the cost for everyone else. Solar came down 90% over the last 10 years, 300% over 30 years. We need to do the same for other technologies. So I had a bill that started in Glasgow, actually started talking about it in Glasgow, and then people liked it. We, got some momentum, and we passed it, again, as part of the Senate package. I have 3 bills, I believe, as part of that Senate package last year, which was tremendous, and John Laird did a great job stewarding us through that process. And this bill we call California Zero because it says our state government should get to net zero by 2035, 10 years ahead of the rest of the state. So that means we will be buying these new technologies for our fleet, for our buildings, for our electricity, and then forcing us to go and make some of these trade-offs as a state. And then the last piece I wanted to mention is look at, okay, if we're not going to get there fully, what are the offsets that are acceptable? What are real carbon offsets that we can do to mitigate the last amount that we can't get to? So offsets and ultimately removing carbon from the atmosphere, what we call CDR, separate from carbon capture, which is a whole separate situation from point solutions. But that CDR, removing carbon from the atmosphere, is another emerging technology that we also need to support.
When in your early life did your passion for environment and community activism and technology and social justice really start to rise in your heart? You know, I can see the passion in your eyes as you talk about this. I know you traveled to Guatemala earlier in your years to work with refugees in the early 90s, and you went to El Salvador. Talk about those experiences and just really where this passion for social justice and environmental justice came up in the heart of Josh Becker.
Well, that's really where it started for me from a social justice standpoint. I would say that time I spent in Guatemala and El Salvador, and hope to be going back to El Salvador very shortly here, maybe with an official, some of my other colleagues. But yeah, you know, seeing that time, it was a very fraught time where you had civil wars, in many cases funded. The U.S. government was not on the right side of those fights that led to mass displacement. And I was in a community of repatriated refugees, ultimately in El Salvador, where I spent most of my time right after they'd signed the peace treaty. In Guatemala, I was there. They had not signed the peace treaty yet. Mm-hmm. But being there and being with the people and just thinking about the role of government was really critical for me. And I came back, and I was doing environmental consulting, came back and said, I'm going to get more involved in government, first interning for Howard Berman and then going to work on campaigns. But I'd say for environment more generally in college, through the PIRGs, through the Mass PIRG and environmental advocacy group, I really learned about...
PIRG, you mean the Public Interest Research Group?
Yes. Yeah. Uh-huh. I learned about organizing through the PIRGs. And that's really where I had my first kind of leadership roles, working on toxics and the bottle bill and other things, going door to door. And I learned a lot of tremendous organizational skills during that time, how to mobilize people on these issues.
Some final thoughts here. When we had that last podcast conversation after COP26, we also talked about the ongoing task that you and your colleagues have, even here in 2023, of further educating the public, your communities about what's at stake, climate crisis-wise, and the challenge of rising above the sea, if no pun intended, of misinformation and climate denialism, like when you have a Southern California gas company that is spending millions of tax dollars over the years to fight key climate solutions, not to mention the other garden variety tribalism and extremism that I referenced. Ultimately, how bad the climate crisis gets is up to us as humans, and it still comes down really to a battle of hearts and minds. Maybe you agree with that. What's your perspective on that ongoing education process? As you implement, as you mandate, you still have to educate.
Well, we do have to continue to educate. I was at a core Democratic Party meeting the other day, and someone was talking to me about windmills in the ocean and concern about the effect on whales. And it was really an industry talking point, an oil industry talking point that somehow ended up and you know, and she had these concerns about offshore wind that were really misguided. So we do have to continue to educate, but we also need to tell those positive stories, right? And we're seeing more and more of them, especially with the help of the Biden administration and the Inflation Reduction Act. We're seeing across the country new battery manufacturing plants, new recycling plants, you know, just clean energy projects that are employing more people, helping communities. And the more and more we can tell those stories as well, and the positive side of this transition is going to be really helpful. So we need to make sure we're doing that as well.
It is great to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. Good luck with your environmental work and otherwise your legislative portfolio and the rest of session. And thank you for joining us. Hope we can do this again sometime.
Thank you for having me here today.
Senator Josh Becker, representing California's 13th Senate District in the Bay Area. And that closes this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus with technical assistance and production support from John Roman, Brian Shadden, McLeana Woods, Michelle Baker, Blake Hooper, and the graphic artistry of Tim Davis. I'm Brian Green here at the State Capitol in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.